Do you want to grow your business and make millions? Well, obviously, we can't guarantee you're going to make millions. In this episode, thought leader Josh Steimle reveals his step-by-step blueprint on how he tapped into the power of building a personal brand through writing for major publications like Forbes and Fortune. You'll learn how a single Forbes article resulted in $5 million in sales for his business. Josh also shares his secrets for landing speaking gigs, getting booked on hundreds of podcasts, and building game-changing connections with influencers like Sir Richard Branson. If you want to grow your business using the credibility and visibility of thought leadership, then you don't want to miss this episode. Hello, incurable creators. I'm excited to bring you some bonus episodes featuring exclusive interviews from the 2023 PodUp Virtual Podcasting Summit. Each Thursday for months, you're going to hear interviews from a diverse range of podcasting and marketing experts. My hope is these repurposed interviews will inspire you with new ideas and insights to take your podcast to the next level. And of course, remember to listen every Tuesday for our regular episodes of Podcasting Secrets as well. Now, let's dive into today's bonus interview from PodUp's 2013 Podcasting Summit. Hello, I'm Nathan Gwilliam, the CEO of PodUp and your host for the Podcasting Summit. I'm joined in this interview with Josh Steimle. Josh is the host of the Published Author podcast. He's done some other ridiculously amazing things. For example, he's written 60 Days to LinkedIn Mastery, which is a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller. He also has developed a thought leadership strategy that he's rolled out to generate more than $10 million for his business. He's also the author of more than 300 articles in publications such as Forbes, Fortune, Time, Fast Company, Mashable, and many others. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode, Josh.
Nathan, it's so fun to be here. We've known each other a long time. I'm excited to be here with you and your audience.
Yes, and today I'm excited to talk about the strategy that you've developed and rolled out so effectively of developing thought leadership and then leveraging that thought leadership to grow a business. So can you just start off by sharing with us your story, your journey to become an expert at thought leadership?
Well, the good news is you can fail a lot at thought leadership and still enjoy great success. I made so many mistakes on my journey, but it all starts in 1999. That's when I started my marketing agency, MWI, and I failed my way forward in that business for the next 13 years. Never quite getting the traction I wanted, but always getting enough traction that it kept me going because I thought success was around the corner. And in 2013, two big things changed. One was I brought on a partner who was great at sales. And the other thing was I got the opportunity to write for Forbes magazine. And I had written some little articles here and there for local publications. And I got one into Fast Company, which was pretty exciting for me. But I'd never had like a column like I got with Forbes. So I started writing for Forbes and I was writing an article or two a week. And that opened so many doors to write for other publications. It landed me a book deal. It got me on podcasts. It got me speaking gigs. It got me a TEDx talk in front of 1,000 people in Hong Kong. I mean, it just opened so many doors and really opened my eyes to the power of personal branding and thought leadership, which were terms I wasn't even familiar with at the time, or this idea of having your own platform. I had never really thought about those things. I was uncomfortable putting myself out there, to be frank. But once I got started on that, it became kind of an addiction. I was like, this is actually kind of fun. I enjoy the thrill of it, the adrenaline rush of being nervous and then putting some content out there and actually seeing it get some traction. And I started to have a lot of fun with it. And now, after all this time, it's great to look back and see multiple books and all these hundreds of articles. And I've been on hundreds of podcasts and speaking on stages and around the world. And it's been such a blast. And it's been so good for my business that I was trying to get traction with all those years. And finally, when I started putting out content, I started getting attention. And lo and behold, we got a lot of clients out of it.
You're talking about leveraging thought leadership as a business strategy, as a marketing strategy. And when you talk about that, I've heard you talk about books, articles, incredible publications, speaking, podcasting. What are some of the other thought leadership things that you've done that are part of that higher level strategy?
A lot of social media. I've experimented with every channel pretty much except TikTok. I just can't bring myself to do it. I even set up a phone for it exclusively, and I still haven't gotten around to it. That's a tough one for me, but LinkedIn has really been a fun one for me. I've had a lot of success on LinkedIn, putting out content and experimenting there. YouTube's been great as well. I've launched courses. I've done in-person events. I've done online events, virtual summits. And so I've tried every tool out there because I like to experiment. I feel like I'm a tinkerer. And so I like to tinker with different things and try it out and see what works and then share with my audience, hey, here's what worked for me and here's what didn't work.
Which of those thought leadership strategies have been most effective for you? Or do they all just kind of work together and play off each other?
Probably writing for the big publications has been the most lucrative, I would say, and has probably opened the most doors. I mean, Forbes alone, I have one article on Forbes that I can track over $5 million in revenue to. One single article. And I can track over 10 million in revenue to all the writing that I did. So that was definitely like the big one. But writing books and podcasts and everything else, it does all kind of fit together and they kind of support each other. I mean, writing for Forbes and other publications got me a book deal, but writing a book deal got me an invite to Richard Branson's island, and I got to hang out with him and a bunch of other marketers for a week, and that led to other things. So one thing leads to another, and they all kind of harmonize and work together.
Right. So it's this all-encompassing thought leadership strategy. Okay, so without giving away too much of your secret sauce, how do you make the jump from an article in Forbes to generating revenue? What kind of revenue were you generating, and how did you facilitate that?
So the revenue I generated from the Forbes article was for my marketing agency, MWI, and the way that I leveraged Forbes was I wrote articles about what we did as an agency. I didn't start out that way. I was writing articles about entrepreneurship originally, and people would read the articles, and I'd get positive feedback, and people would say, oh, I loved your article. It was really interesting, but there was no reason for them to reach out and hire my agency because I wrote an article about entrepreneurship. And so I started tweaking that. And now when you write for these publications, it's not like you can promote yourself. You can't say, here's this great thing that my agency does and come hire us. You can't do that or you'll get kicked off the platform. But I was able to write articles like, here's how to hire the right SEO agency or the right digital marketing agency for you. Here are 4 steps to do that. Well, that wasn't promoting my business, but it was speaking from an area of expertise that I had related to my business. And what would happen is people would read an article like that, and then they'd say, well, gee, this guy wrote a good article about how to hire an agency. Who is this guy? And then they'd look at my bio and see, oh, he actually owns an agency, and here's a link. And then they'd go to my website and say, well, if this guy's writing for Forbes and he knows all about agency stuff and he runs an agency and he's good enough at it to get into Forbes writing about it, maybe we should just go hire this guy's agency. And so that's how the lead flow came.
So the credibility of Forbes flowed through to you. They believe you were credible because you were writing for Forbes. Okay. Let's say somebody wants to get started in this and somebody would like to start a thought leadership business model, this transformation like you did. Where would they begin?
I think you begin where you're comfortable. It's kind of like they say the workout plan or the best diet for you is the one that you're actually going to do. And for me, TikTok, for example, is hard. It's hard for me to get on video and speak to a screen. I can talk to you, I'm comfortable doing this, but when I'm just speaking to the screen, it's really awkward for me. And so that makes it harder for me to get on YouTube or TikTok or a video-based platform. I also, I struggle with audio platforms as well. Can't remember what that app was that came out like a year or 2 ago, and there was a big splash, and now I never hear about it anymore.
Clubhouse.
Yeah, it's like audio was difficult for me too. I really thrived with writing, and so I went to writing as kind of my go-to. But I also thrived on podcasts because I do enjoy speaking to people. And when I'm speaking to people, then I'm not conscious of the camera. I don't feel nervous about it because we're just here having a conversation. And so I not only launched multiple podcasts, but I also was on as a guest on a lot of podcasts, hundreds at this point. And so those were 2 of the channels, writing and then going on podcasts and doing podcasts where it was an interview format. Those were easy for me because those were comfortable. And I think that's where anybody should start, is with whatever they're comfortable with. Now, there's also the question of, well, where is your audience hanging out? Because if your audience is hanging out somewhere that you're not comfortable with, you can spend a lot of time somewhere else. But if your audience isn't there, then you're just spinning your wheels. And so there is that area of compromise where you say, well, this is what I'm comfortable with, but my audience is hanging out over here. And you have to figure out how you can merge what you're comfortable with where your audience is.
So, Josh, you've mentioned that you've had a lot of success leveraging LinkedIn in this thought leadership strategy. Can you share with us some of your best secrets for success that people can implement to help in their LinkedIn strategies?
The biggest hint is just be helpful. Be a normal human being and be helpful. Try to help people, give them information that they need. I see a lot of people on LinkedIn who are trying to be self-promotional, or they're trying to kind of hide that they're being self-promotional, but they're still being self-promotional. And the biggest thing you can do to help yourself on LinkedIn is to forget about yourself and just help other people from the area of expertise that you're also trying to sell. So if I'm a marketer, I'm going to go on LinkedIn and I'm going to talk about marketing, and I'm going to give all my secrets away. And what happens when you give all your secrets away is that people either want more and they want to pay for more, or they hear what you're saying and they're like, man, that sounds great, but I don't want to do that. I don't have time to do that, but I've got money, so I'll just go pay this guy to do it for me. So they're either paying for more of the same or they're paying for implementation. That's what happens when you give all your secrets away. When you hold back, it just makes people feel like, he's trying to get something, or he's trying to trap me into something. But when you're just genuine and you're trying to help and you're giving it away for free, that tends to be the best strategy on LinkedIn, whether it's video or text or slides or whatever content you're posting. And there are things that perform better than others. Generally on LinkedIn, text posts tend to do better than a graphic that you might post. But that's always changing. What doesn't change is helpful content always wins, because that's the content people engage with. That's the content that people consume. And ultimately, that's what gives you the win.
Okay, everybody, don't forget that. Helpful content is what wins. Focus on giving value and helping your audience. Okay, you talked about how you've been on hundreds of podcasts. And I think most of our listeners would love to be a guest on hundreds of podcasts. Can you share with us your secrets to success there? How did you get on hundreds of podcasts, and how can our audience leverage that strategy?
There's a little bit of a catch-22 here, because what I really found was that once you're on 10 or 20 podcasts, then the invites just start coming in. I don't know where they come from, but I assume it's that people see that I was on some podcast and they're like, oh, I'd like to have that guy on my podcast too. So when it comes to podcasting, nothing breeds success like having some early wins. But in the early days, a lot of it did come from my writing on Forbes, my blogging, and me putting myself out there in other ways. I never really went around and pitched myself to podcasts. I did a little bit of that, but I didn't do a lot of it. And so I would say 95% of the podcasts that I was on or have been on, I didn't reach out to them. They reached out to me, and they reached out to me because I was already on a few podcasts. But of course, you have to prime the pump. So how can you do that? By having something credible that you can put out there and then showing it to people to say, hey, this is somebody we should have on the podcast. In my case, my writing led to some of that. But of course, you're a podcaster, I'm a podcaster. When I'm looking for a guest, I'm looking for somebody that I know is going to be good on camera and good on audio, because I record both the audio and the video. And so I want to make sure that they're good at that. And if I just see their writing, that doesn't really tell me how good they are. They might be terrible on camera, even if they're a great writer, right? And so putting yourself out there on video and even launching your own podcast, I think, is a great way to get on. And it's so easy these days. I mean, you've got Anchor, you can just upload stuff to YouTube. There's AI editors, there's all sorts of stuff. You've got your software. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff out there to make launching a podcast easy. And if you launch your own, then you're really proving it to other hosts to say, hey, this person has a podcast, they sound good, let's have them on our podcast. And one of the things I love is the collaborative nature of podcasting. If I have an audience and you have an audience, and I have you on my show and you have me on your show, and we trade audiences, well, we just both doubled our audiences perhaps. And it didn't cost us anything. It's complete win-win for us. And so, you see a lot of that in the podcasting world.
If I can recap and make sure I understand what you're saying, the strategy that led to your success in getting on other podcasts was that you established your credibility somewhere else through your writing. And then they found you through that writing, and then that carried through to your first podcast, and then your first podcast plus your writing carried you through to be invited on the other podcasts. And you didn't really have to push it that hard. It just kind of happened because you established your credibility.
I feel like I cheated in a way. I mean, I didn't cheat, but I got into Forbes and all these other publications. So it was kind of like I had that leg up on getting into podcasts because I was in these publications. And it's not necessarily easy to get into those publications. And so when I'm speaking to a general audience and saying, how do you get on podcasts? I wouldn't say the route to go is try to get in and write for a bunch of these big publications, because I think there are easier ways to get on podcasts. On the other hand, if you can get that kind of PR exposure, if you can get into articles, that's a great thing to be able to send out to a podcast and pitch them, right? To say, hey, here's me speaking in Forbes and Business Insider and Entrepreneur and Inc. And here's my topic. And because I'm in these publications, you know that I'm real. You know that I'm legit. You know that I'm somebody that people are listening to. And I would like to be on your podcast. I mean, if somebody reaches out to me with that, it's like I can check that box on authority and credibility immediately and say, yeah, this is probably somebody I'd be interested in having on the show. Versus somebody reaching out and it's like, well, who are you? I don't know who you are, and I have to go out and dig around to figure it out.
Did that same strategy for success apply to your speaking? Did you get invited to speak for the same reasons you got invited on other podcasts?
Absolutely. A lot of it started with these publications. I mean, that's how I got my TEDx talk. Was I was writing for Forbes and I ran into a license holder for TEDx. And I mean, he was a nice guy. Maybe he would have sat down with me and talked with me regardless. But the fact that I was writing for Forbes and these other publications, I think that made him really interested to sit down with me and talk to me. And after I got to know him, I asked him, hey, so how does this work? Like, how does somebody get on the TEDx stage? I'd like to do that someday. And he just said to me, you're in. You're in. You know me. I'm the license holder. I decide who gets on. You're on the stage. What do you want to talk about? And that was it. And everybody else had to go through this application process and get screened and apply and like practice their talk in front of other people. And he just stuck me on the stage with none of that because I came in through that Forbes angle. And that, getting the TEDx thing, that led to other speaking opportunities because then I could tell people, hey, I'm a TEDx speaker. And it just checked that credibility box.
Yours is a story of how establishing credibility initially has opened up hundreds and hundreds of doors for you that you've been able to go through and leverage to create a successful business.
And I'd like to say that I was really smart and I was clever in doing this, but I wasn't. Like, these things mostly fell into my lap kind of almost accidentally. I mean, I wrote 1,000 blog posts before I ever got the opportunity to write for Forbes. So you can make the case that I built my own luck for 10 years before it actually paid off. But then I happened to know somebody and they happened to know somebody at Forbes and they connected me. And then writing for Forbes happened to lead to this other thing. I mean, there were so many things where I look back and I'm like, man, like one of those steps and nothing else would have happened, but everything just kind of fell into place and then amazing things happened.
Okay, so how does podcasting play in to all of this? It's one more way you can establish your thought leadership, or is it more than that?
I think it's more than that because what I've talked about a lot here already is who you know. I mean, I got into Forbes because of who I knew. I knew somebody who was writing for Forbes who knew an editor who made an introduction. And when it comes to podcasting, I can't think of a better way to get to know powerful people who can help you. Writing for Forbes was great because I could call up almost anybody and say, hey, I'm writing an article for Forbes. I'd like to talk to your CEO. I'd like to talk to this executive. And that was great. I actually feel like podcasting is easier, which is strange because anybody can start a podcast and not anybody can write for Forbes. But with my podcasts, I feel like it's been easier to get people to say, yeah, I'll sit down and talk to you for an hour. And the people I've met through my podcast, best-selling authors, I'll give you one example. So there's this author, her name is Shinran. She goes by just one name, Shinran, Xinran. And she's from China. She's written a number of best-selling books. She now lives in London. And she's huge. Like, she's a big celebrity with people who follow China and know China because she's written these big books. She was a newscaster in China. And I reached out to her because I had this published author podcast, and I knew of her because I used to live in China. And I just thought, I just want to talk to her. I want to know more about her and ask her a bunch of questions. So I invited her on my podcast. She accepted, and I got to talk to her for about an hour. But now we're friends. I communicate with her frequently on social media. I send her messages. She sends me messages back. We have these long chats. We have phone calls. And recently I wrote a memoir about adopting my daughter from China. And I wrote this up and I thought, I wonder if I could get this published or if it's just something for my family. Well, I sent it off to Shinran and she's reading it now. And she said, I'm going to read this and I'll get back to you on this. Well, how in the world would I have ever made that happen without the podcast? How could I have gone to this New York Times bestselling author and said, hey, will you read my 400-page memoir and give me some feedback? Like, there's no way anybody would just do that out of the blue. But because I had created this relationship with her through the podcast, I was able to reach out and send it to her and just say, hey, would you be willing to take a look at the intro to this? And she's like, no, I'm going to read the whole thing. So it's like those relationships, and that's just one out of hundreds of stories I could tell. But those relationships, I don't feel like that would have come around any other way. But because it's a podcast and because I do the video, I'm having this hour-long face-to-face conversation with these people, and we're developing a relationship. Some of those relationships turn into friendships. And then it just becomes that game of, who do you know who can do this thing? And that's not why I do it. I didn't start the podcast so that I could reach out to people and use them to satisfy my own ends or my plans. I did it because I love talking to people, and I especially love talking to authors about their books. But when I know somebody and I need to get something done or I need to help somebody else get something done, I think, well, who do I know? And so often it goes back to these guests on my podcast where I think, well, I know this person who would be a great connection for my friend over here. And I make that connection and everybody wins from it. And again, I just don't see how that would have happened any other way other than having this podcast.
Okay, so in addition to that, how else has having a podcast helped you grow your business?
I mean, I've gotten clients directly from podcasts. I've created business partnerships from podcasts. I had one guy on the Published Author podcast, and he runs a program, and I had never heard of this program that he ran, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Well, then I referred somebody to him because I didn't know anybody else who did this thing that he does, and he paid me a $5,000 commission. And I was like, oh, well, that's nice. Like, I'd be happy to make this connection anyway, but if somebody's going to send me $5,000, like, so much the better. Well, to date, I think he's paid me like $60,000 in commissions or something just for making these connections. I mean, I'm not doing any work. I got a $12,000 commission from this guy the other day for literally 20 minutes of work, maybe 20, if that. And that's a connection I made through the podcast. And again, that's just one example. There are other examples of people I've partnered with, that I've worked with, and it's helping me grow the business. I've found, just employees. I mean, just all sorts of things. People I hire, partnerships, clients, all of these things have come to me through my podcast.
The way you describe it, it doesn't seem that hard. Although I know you've written so much and you put countless hours into the content creation and nurturing of relationships. I'm sure it's a lot harder than how you're making it seem, but you make it seem like it's very possible. Is it really that easy, or is it harder than I'm imagining?
I think it was harder for me than I make it sound, but again, I make all the mistakes. I do everything the wrong way 10 times before I figure it out. And so I think people doing their research, listening to interviews like this and the other ones that you're doing, This is where you learn how to avoid all those mistakes. I made 60 grand in commissions from this one guy that I met through my podcast, but I also spent 80 grand that same year producing the podcast. So I was still at a net negative looking at just that one thing. And I spent so much money doing things that didn't work. And I spent so much time doing interviews with the wrong people, or doing interviews the wrong way, or not having my ad in the middle of the episode the right way. There are just so many little things that I did the wrong way that if you figure it out the right way, I think it is a lot easier. And again, today, the tools that are out there are just amazing for editing and getting stuff done. Where a couple of years ago, not even a couple of years ago, you'd pay $400 or $500, $800 to edit an episode and show notes and get everything done the right way. And now with AI tools coming out, it's like the cost of producing a high quality podcast has come down so much. And ultimately, it's going to come down to the point where it's basically free, except for your time. That's the only thing you're really going to be paying out is your time. And so when you look at it that way, it's easier than ever. And there's so many people out there teaching you how to do it the right way and how to avoid the mistakes that I think it's a lot easier even than the way that I did it. And I don't think the way I did it was all that bad.
Your podcast is about being a published author. How can publishing a book help a podcaster?
This really goes to credibility. I mean, you can grow an audience. It will help you grow an audience to have a book out there that people are reading. It can lead people to your podcast, especially if you mention your podcast in the book, which you should do. But a book is, as somebody said, a business card on steroids. It's credibility. When somebody has a book, you know they put real time and effort and thought into that. You know it's their best stuff. And so whenever somebody has a book, it just puts them on a different level. As a paid speaker, I started getting paid a lot more once I had a book, just because I had a book. And as a podcaster, I mean, the difference between me hosting, of course, with the published author podcast, I have to be an author, right? And it helps that I was able to become a best-selling author to host that type of podcast. But no matter what the podcast is, if you have a book that's related to the topic of the podcast, it gives you that credibility to say, hey, I'm an expert on this topic. You really should be listening to my podcast. Now, can you get by without a book? Of course. Joe Rogan, that I know of, isn't an author. If he is, he's not doing a very good job promoting his book because I've never heard of it. There are a lot of people out there who are super successful as podcasters without a book, but just like podcasting, it's so easy to put a book out today compared to how it was a few years ago. And so by putting a book out there, it just gives you that much more credibility to say, I'm the expert on this topic and you should listen to my show.
What are the biggest mistakes that podcasters make or challenges that they face in establishing this thought leadership and credibility?
I think mistake number one is not doing it, but assuming that you're actually doing it. Mistake number two is not knowing who your audience is and what your message is for that audience. Getting really, really specific. And I think I actually kind of messed this up on the Published Author podcast, because when I started it, I thought, I'm going to go out and interview authors, and other authors will want to listen to that because I'm sharing these secrets. I'm getting these authors to share their secrets about what it was like to write and publish a book. And I think I would have actually gotten a lot more traction with my podcast if I had taken a little bit different angle with that. I think if I were actually interviewing authors about their books and promoting their books, number one, I think the authors would be more interested in talking to me. Not that it's been hard to get them. But number two, I think there are more people interested in the books authors have written than in the stories of how they wrote those books. Like you're saying, the audience would be bigger because the audience is everybody who's read that book or everybody who likes that author. Whereas right now, my audience is everybody who wants to be an author. And what I didn't realize is I could have the best of both worlds. I could get the big audience of all those people and still get the people who say, well, I'm an author and I want to learn from this author. Well, I could do both. I could get the story of the book during the first 20, 30 minutes and just have them talk about the book. And then I could transition and say, okay, Now let's talk about how you wrote the book. Give me that. And if people want to drop off at that point because they're not authors and they don't care about that, that's fine. And that's almost what I did with the podcast, but I didn't position the podcast that way. I positioned it as the only reason you want to listen to this podcast is if you are an author looking for tips on how to become a better author. And that's a great niche audience, but it really limited my reach. I think if I had gone the broader route, I actually would have attracted more of those aspiring authors in the long run.
Josh, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. If our audience enjoyed what they heard or saw and they want to learn more about you and your services and products, what are the best ways for them to do that?
They can reach out to me through publishedauthor.com or my personal website, joshsteimle.com. Steimle spelled Steimle.
And for those of you that are watching or listening, if you have not yet checked out VIP Upgrade below, please click on the button and learn about the 4 bonuses that you can get for free and learn how those can help you grow and monetize your podcast. And again, thank you for joining us. And I wish you success as you implement thought leadership to grow your reach as a podcaster. Here are my key takeaways from this episode. Number 1, writing for major publications like Forbes and Fortune was critical for establishing Josh's credibility and thought leadership, leading to business growth and many opportunities. Number 2, one Forbes article generated more than $5 million in revenue for Josh's marketing agency. Number 3, thought leadership content should focus on helping others rather than self-promotion. Give away your best ideas. Number 4, start creating thought leadership content on platforms where you feel most comfortable, writing, podcasting, video, etc. Number 5, getting early wins with some initial quality content can breed more success and opportunities to publish more widely. Number 6, leverage existing credibility and platforms to get invited to podcasts and speaking engagements. Number 7, podcasting builds powerful relationships and partnerships that can dramatically grow your business. Number 8, publishing a book takes your credibility and thought leadership to another level, opening more doors. Do you want your podcasting to be easier, less expensive, and a lot more successful? Then I recommend you check out the all-in-one podcasting platform, PodUp. It has more than 35 integrated modules that can help you create, grow, and monetize your podcast all in one place. You can get a free trial at podup.com. Thanks for joining me for this episode, and I wish you success as you grow your podcast and personal brand.